The reports had been on the radio all day, though she hadn't paid much attention to them. Some crazy man had escaped from the state asylum. They were calling him the Hook Man, since he had lost his right arm and had replaced it with a hook. He was a killer, and everyone in the region was warned to keep watch and report anything suspicious. But this didn't interest her. She was more worried about what to wear on her date. After several consultation calls with friends, she chose a blue outfit in the very latest style. It was ready and waiting on the porch when her boyfriend came to pick her up in his car. They went to a drive-in movie with another couple, then dropped them off and went parking in the local lover's lane. The blue outfit was a hit, and she cuddled close to her boyfriend as they kissed to the sound of romantic music on the radio. Then, the announcer came on and repeated the warnings she had heard that afternoon.
WKDR breaking news. Police sources are advising the public to remain at home. The escaped murderer, known as the Hook Killer, is still at large. Once again, the police are advising that you remain at home, secure, until this murderer is apprehended.
An insane killer with a hook in place of his right hand was loose in the area. Suddenly, the dark, moonless night didn't seem so romantic to her. The lover's lane was secluded, and it was off the beaten track. A perfect spot for a deranged madman to lurk, she thought, pushing her amorous boyfriend away. "Maybe we should get out of here," she said. "That Hook Man sounds dangerous." Come on, babe, it's nothing," her boyfriend said, trying to get in another kiss. She pushed him away again. "No, really. We're all alone out here. I'm scared," she said. They argued for a moment. Then the car shook a bit, as if something or someone had touched it. She gave a shriek and said, "Get us out of here now!" "Jeez," her boyfriend said in disgust. But he turned the key and went roaring out of the lover's lane with a screeching of his tires. They drove home in stony silence, and when they pulled into her driveway, he refused to help her out of the car. He was being so unreasonable, she fumed to herself. She opened the door indignantly and stepped into her driveway, with her chin up and her lips set. Whirling around, she slammed the door as hard as she could. And then she screamed. Her boyfriend leapt out of the car and caught her in his arms. "What is it? What's wrong?" he shouted. Then he saw it. A bloody hook hung from the handle of the passenger's side door. Years ago, there were a group of 3 girls that went to high school together. They were all my best friends, and one night during the summer holidays, we decided to have a sleepover party. They spent all day planning their sleepover, and because they were all horror fans, they decided to rent a scary movie. It was late at night when the 3 girls piled into a car and drove to their local video rental store. But it was closed. The girls spent the next half hour driving around town, looking for a video store that was still open. Eventually, they found a small shop located in a side street and went inside. The girls could not agree on a film to rent. So one of the girls came up to the woman behind the counter and asked her if she had any suggestions. The woman told her she had just the thing for them and disappeared into the back room. While they were waiting, one of the girls noticed a videotape lying on the counter. Didn't have a box cover or a label, and it seemed very dirty and stained. She was curious to see what it was and reached out to pick it up. Just then, the woman came running out of the back room, slamming her hand down on the tape, pulling it away. With a strange smile on her face, she said,
"That's not something you girls should be watching."
When they asked her what it was, the woman said to not touch it, and all she would say was that it was a home movie. Then she handed them an old horror movie and told them that this would be much better for them to watch. Eventually, the girls agreed to rent the tape that the woman suggested. While she was in the back room searching for the film, one of the girls took the opportunity to swipe the mysterious videotape, and she stuffed it in her purse. Later that night, when the girls returned home, the girl who stole the tape took it out of her purse, and she convinced the other two to watch it. They put the tape in the video recorder and pressed play. All of a sudden, the power went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. However, the television was still on. With a crackle of static, the video started playing, and on the screen, they saw a woman tied to a wooden stake. She was surrounded by angry men and women who were carrying burning torches. They were shouting and spitting on her, and then they set fire to the wood beneath the woman's feet. The woman began laughing maniacally, and the people started yelling out things like, "Burn the witch!" and "This is your punishment for practicing black magic." As the flames rose higher and higher, licking at the woman's face, she screamed out a curse, saying all who witnessed her death will suffer the same fate in 2 days' time. There was a screech of static, and the VCR began making skipping sounds before it suddenly cut off. The terrified girls sat in the dark for a long time until the power came back on. They tried to convince each other that it must have been some type of prank. After a while, they agreed that they should return the tape immediately. When they arrived at the location of the video store, it was gone. All they found was an abandoned building and an empty lot. 2 days later, all 3 of the girls were dead. The first girl was found floating in a swimming pool. Her body was burned beyond recognition. The charred remains of the second girl were discovered in the middle of a park, and the third girl's body was found in a furnace. When the police were investigating the mysterious deaths, they thought it was just a very strange coincidence that all 3 girls had been burned to death on the same day. In each case, the police thought it had been spontaneous combustion, but the weirdest thing about it was that nothing around them had been touched by the flames. They found a trash can outside the house of one of the girls. It had been set on fire and was burned out. Everything inside it was destroyed, except for a videotape, which had been inexplicably left untouched by the flames. I lived in a house from hell for 4 years. From age 11 to almost 16, there was always something happening. Doors flying open and shut, voices, footsteps. Nothing ever stayed where you put it. I was alone a lot because both my parents worked, and I was constantly terrified. One of the most gut-disturbing things, though, was the girl in my bathroom. Every time I walked by my bathroom, which was constantly since it was right outside of my bedroom, I saw a little girl with blonde curled hair and a rose-colored dress. She just stood there, staring, looking like a photograph from 1905. I started closing the door so I could walk by without seeing her, but she was always there when I opened it. Once I stepped in past her. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her there. I felt sorry for her because she was stuck there, just like me, but probably forever. As the years went by and things in the house continued to get worse and she started seeming darker, I started feeling like she wasn't a little girl. I knew there was something ugly in the house, and I felt like it was presenting this sympathetic figure to me. Then I started thinking like I was losing my mind. One day when I was 14, I had a friend from out of town come to stay with me for a week. I hadn't told her anything whatsoever about the house because I didn't think she would come if I did. Right after she got there, we were sitting in my room and she went to go to the bathroom. About a minute later, she came back with a puzzled look on her face. "So, there's a little girl in your bathroom?" She hangs out in there. Blonde hair, curls, pink dress." "Yeah, you know that's not really a little girl, don't you?" I almost threw up. I was so relieved and terrified and excited and ready to run out of the house screaming. She stopped using that bathroom for the rest of the week, and I used it as little as possible without pissing off my parents, who just didn't want to believe. Eventually, we moved out and I couldn't have been happier. I distanced myself from it mentally as much as I could. Then, when I was 18, I took a friend on a road trip to gather up a few things I had left at the house. My parents hadn't managed to sell the house and wouldn't for about 5 years. The minute that we got on the property, my friend felt uncomfortable. When we came around the bend in the long, steep driveway, he went completely white. I could tell something was wrong, but he kept insisting he was okay, so we got to work. After a while, he asked to use the bathroom, and I directed him to mine. Not 20 seconds after he left, he came running back in for breath. He slammed the door shut behind him. He started babbling on about a blonde little girl who really isn't a little girl. All of a sudden, he went silent. He went dead still. He looked at me in the eye and he said very solemnly, "She isn't happy with you. You left, and you weren't supposed to." We threw whatever we could grab in 2 trips to my car. After I walked him to another bathroom and we waited outside the door, we got the hell out of there at top speed. My childhood home was in a small town in Indiana. It was a beautiful blue Dutch colonial home in a neighborhood lined in huge old pine trees. Our house had been built in the 1800s, and I always had a sense it was haunted. The neighborhood was filled with kids my age, and all of the families got together for summer block parties. Pretty idyllic. The only bad thing about our neighborhood was at the end of our cul-de-sac was the town's hospital. Our hospital kind of looked like a brick version of Hogwarts, maybe with less spires. It wasn't too bad, except that the parking lot and the entrance for the emergency room essentially backed up to several of our backyards. Every once in a while, we'd be woken up by an ambulance. On special occasions, a helicopter would land behind our house to fly a patient. to Indianapolis or Cincinnati. And the adults would bring the little kids out in our jammies to watch it land and take off. Kind of morbid, I understand. Other than the noise and the bustle of the emergency rooms, we rarely noticed the hospital. Sometimes we would tell ghost stories about the people who died in the hospital and how they wandered our neighborhood in the afterlife. One night, in early January, several inches of snow had fallen in a few hours. As a second grader, I was looking forward to the prospect of a snow day, and I stayed up later than normal. I finally zonked out and all was quiet. The snow even muffled the ambulances that came in and out that night. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. You know when you heard something in your house and it wakes you up? Well, it wasn't one of those instantly. I sat up, but I heard nothing at first. I didn't see any light from under my parents' bedroom door, so I knew they were still sleeping. So I laid back down to try and fall back asleep when a noise that had woken me up, it came again. It's a noise that still haunts me. It was like a low moan, like someone quietly sobbing. I was perfectly still, trying to make sure I was hearing a human. Indeed, I was. The low moan turned into a sad, sing-songy, "Help me," over and over. My mind instantly went to our neighborhood ghosts. I could tell it was coming from downstairs. So I snuck out of bed. My bedroom was at the top of our staircase, and looking down, I could see right out of the back door and onto our back deck. I could see several inches of snow blown up against the glass sliding door. The moaning continued. I was convinced it was downstairs. I crept to the top of the carpeted stairs and I hunched down to listen. As soon as I hunched down, I saw her. There was the face of a woman at our back door. Her hair was frozen from the snow and she was wearing a hospital gown. Her tears frozen on her cheeks. She was barefoot. She was crying for help. She looked right through the door at me, and I froze. Her moaning got louder, and I felt like it would shatter the glass sliding door. She began pulling at her gown and a dressing on her arm. When she finally looked away, I felt like I could move, and I bolted. I ran to my dad and I woke him up crying that the neighborhood ghost was out in the snow. He ran to the stairs. He saw the ghost. He immediately called 911. It turns out that a patient from the dementia or Alzheimer's wing had gotten out. Barefoot and lost, she had found a way to our home. The orderlies quickly came and got her. I don't know if she lived much after that. She had to have gotten hypothermia. After that, we tried to avoid the hospital. Like, if we didn't pay attention to its ghosts, they couldn't find us. Even though my family moved from that house several years later. On a particularly cold and snowy night, I sometimes still dream of that poor woman. She may not have been a ghost, but she was haunted. Mad Henry was a hermit who lived alone in a decrepit mansion at the edge of town. Rumors were rife about the wild-eyed man. Some folks said that he was a magician who called upon the powers of darkness to wreak havoc upon his neighbors. Others called him a mad doctor who could restore life to foul corpses from the local cemetery. No respectable citizen in town had anything to do with Mad Henry. And one year, a new family moved to town with a lovely daughter, Rachel, who caught Mad Henry's eye. He showered the maiden with gifts, goblets of pure gold, necklaces of pearl, in a pot of daisies that never dropped a single petal. Despite the gifts, Rachel fell in love with another, Jeffrey, a handsome young man just home from university. A week after they eloped, leaving behind a stunned Mad Henry. When Rachel and Jeffrey returned from their elopement, they threw a big ball and invited everyone in town. While Rachel was waltzing with her father, she heard a clap of thunder. Lightning flashed again and again. Suddenly, the double doors blew open and a breeze whirled in, bringing with it the smell of dead, decaying things. Mad Henry loomed in the doorway, pupils gleaming red with anger. He was followed by the grotesque figures of the dead, who came marching 2 by 2 into the room. Their eye sockets glowed with blue fire as they surrounded the room. 2 of the corpses captured Jeffrey, and they threw him down at the feet of their lord. Red eyes gleaming, Mad Henry drew a silver-bladed knife and casually cut the bridegroom's throat from ear to ear. Rachel screamed and ran forward, pushing through the foul, stinking corpses of the dead, and she flung herself upon her dying husband. "Kill us both!" she cried desperately. But Mad Henry plucked the lass out of the pool of blood surrounding her dead husband, and he carried her out into the thundering night. Behind him, the army of the dead turned from the grisly scene and followed their master. The sounds of thunder and lightning faded away as the alchemist and his dead companions disappeared into the dark night. Jeffrey's father and Rachel's father gathered a small mob and followed the evil hermit, intent upon saving Rachel. When they searched Mad Henry's house, they found it completely empty save for a light, which shone from a series of mysterious globes that bobbed near the ceiling of each room. Mad Henry had vanished. Search parties scoured the countryside for days, but turned up nothing. Jeffrey was buried in the local cemetery, and the dance hall was torn down. No one in town spoke about what happened. No one dared imagine what became of poor Rachel. A year to the day after the ball, a timid knock sounded upon the door of Rachel's parents' home. When her father opened it, he saw a gaunt grey figure on the stoop. Her eyes were dull with exhaustion and pain. It was Rachel. Her tongue had been cut out so she couldn't speak. But when she produced a knife from her tattered garments, the knife with a silver blade that they had last seen in the hands of Mad Henry, the gleam of satisfaction in Rachel's eyes told them that the streaks of blood that coated the knife were those of Mad Henry. That night, Rachel died in her sleep with a peaceful smile upon her ravaged face. The master of the plantation was a firm supporter of the Confederate president and had committed to send as much food as he could to the Southern Army. Things were going well at first until the Yankees began attacking the master's supply lines. The master suspected a traitor among his slaves and soon discovered that the Yankee spy was a slave woman named Big Liz. She was a behemoth of a girl who could pick up 2 full-grown pigs, one under each arm, and cart them over to the slaughterhouse without assistance. If he confronted her directly and she fought back, she'd take him to pieces. So the master came up with a different plan to rid himself of the spy. He approached the giant girl and asked her to assist him with a special task. He told her that President Jefferson Davis had entrusted him with a large chest full of gold. Keep it out of the Yankees' hands. He wanted to bury the chest where it'd never be found. The girl's eyes gleamed when she heard this false report. The master knew she was already planning to betray the existence of the chest to the Yankees. The master made Big Liz carry the heavy trunk several miles out into the swampland, asked her to dig a deep hole for the trunk. He sat at his leisure while she worked and strained for hours against the muddy ground, which kept oozing back onto the hole. When the slave girl was completely exhausted, the master decreed the hole to be large enough for his war chest. Warily, Big Liz dropped the shovel, pulled the heavy chest down until it lay at her feet. Then she started to climb out of the deep hole. But the master barred her way, and Big Liz gazed up at him in a sudden fear as he loomed over her. "Traitor! Yankee spy!" the master hissed. "There's only one path open to a traitor." The master swung his sword at her, and the sharp edge of the blade cut clean through the slave girl's neck. Her head went rolling away into the tall grass as her body toppled across the chest. The master heaped dirt over the chest and the body of the slave girl who had betrayed him. Briefly, he considered finding her head and burying it in the pit with the body, but it was too dark to go wandering into the dangerous marshland, and he knew the scavengers would make short work of the head when they found it. As the master walked toward home through the dark swamp, he became aware of a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as if someone were watching him. The master walked faster as clouds obscured the light of the moon. The master's teeth were chattering as a breeze cut through him like a sharpened blade of a sword at his side, and his straining ears picked up the sound of footsteps on the path behind him. The master was filled with a terrible superstitious dread of demons and witches and ghosts. He broke out into a panicked run, fleeing up the path as fast as his legs would carry him. To his relief, he saw the lights of his house rise up before him, and he knew he was home. As he rounded the back corner of his house, he was confronted by a massive, dirt-encrusted figure that glowed with blue fire. The smell of rotting leaves and marsh grass filled his nostrils as his eyes raced up and up the tall creature until they rested on the stump of its neck, where a head had resided only an hour ago. Then he heard a chuckle from the creature's side. He saw the phantom's head tucked under her arm. The master stumbled backward, gabbling desperately in fear, as the ghost placed her head upon the ground with one hand and grabbed the collar of his shirt with the other. The murdered slave girl snapped the master's neck in two and dropped his dead body to the ground beneath his bedroom window. Then Big Liz gathered up a severed head and vanished into the darkness. They say on the anniversary of her death, the ghost of Big Liz still may be seen roaming around the swamplands near her old home. Anyone foolish enough to walk near her grave will be driven away by the phantom, which to this day still defends the place where the Confederate chest is buried.
I didn't grow up believing in ghosts. And one morning, when we were 16,
when my friend's mom picked us up for the carpool, I mentioned that I was really creeped out by this bathroom under the stairs in my house that no one ever used. I couldn't exactly define why I felt this way, I just found it eerie. The house that I grew up in was an old Victorian home built in the 1800s, so eerie vibes were part of the package. Hearing this reminded my friend of her own creepy bathroom association. She told me that when she lived in the German countryside for a year, there was a little section in the home that no one but her middle sister used, who was about 9 years old at the time. During this time period, her sister would wake up with bloodshot eyes, sometimes even bruises, and feel totally exhausted. They did everything to investigate what was going on, including sleeping in her room, working with a child psychologist and a school counselor. My friend doesn't remember much from this time period other than her sister being disturbed by something the year they lived there. She mentioned that she and her other sister, the oldest, also hated using that bathroom because they would feel off and find thick black hair stuck in the drain, even though each of them had fine blonde hair. At this point in this story, my friend's mom abruptly stopped the car and jerked her head around and said,
That's where the woman killed herself. She drowned herself in that bathtub.
Her mom was clearly shaken. She said part of the reason they moved was because something felt off in the house.
Late at night, I usually go to the bathroom multiple times, but for the past 4 days, every time I go to leave, I can see myself still standing in the mirror from the corner of my eye. It is like the other me is watching me leave the washroom. It terrifies me to the point where I almost run out without looking directly at the mirror. I never told my husband about it because I didn't want to acknowledge it out loud. Earlier today, I took a nap in our bed while he sat in the chair next to me watching TV. When I woke up, he told me that he had seen me sit up and crawl backward to the edge of the bed and stand up in front of our bedroom door from the corner of his eye. He thought it was weird that I got up like that because I'm in the last month of my pregnancy and I can't really move so good without hurting. So he tried talking to me. When I didn't answer, he looked at the door to find me not there and still sleeping in bed. I got really creeped out and I finally told him about what I'd been seeing in the bathroom. He thought it was creepy as well, but he didn't want to talk about it anymore because he thinks it will give whatever it is power or energy. I have no idea what it wants or why we both saw it.
To celebrate their first year in university, 6 friends went camping in the wilderness. After driving for several hours from the nearest town, they discovered a lagoon, nestled beside a cliff, ideal for diving. They set up camp in the woods nearby and spent the evening swimming in the warm, clear water. As the sun sunk below the trees, one of the friends went up to the highest point on the cliff and jumped off, while the other 5 watched. Their laughter slowly subsided as they waited for him to surface. It only took a half a minute for them to dive in after their friend. Struggling and sputtering among the reeds in the lagoon, they searched hopelessly for him. Finally, they disentangled themselves and came up, but they never saw their friend again. Heartbroken, they returned to the city and passed a strange and lonely year in which their only solace was the knowledge that they would return to the lagoon to honor the anniversary of their friend's death. A year had passed and they returned to the lagoon as a memorial. But as they approached, they saw their friend standing there, head bowed. Excitedly, they called to him and began running towards him, but he didn't turn. As they got closer, they called him more desperately, but still to no avail. With joy, they ran towards him, but they stopped dead when they saw not 1, but 5 crosses on the waterside.
When I was 15, I traveled to Europe with my family. We stayed in Ettal, Germany, in a small inn for a few nights. My parents had a double bed on the second floor. My sisters had the double bedroom next to theirs, and I was lucky enough to have a single room all to myself at the far end of the hall. When we went to check into our rooms, as soon as I entered the hallway our rooms were in, I remember almost feeling as though I'd walked into a wall of bad energy. I just felt so unnerved and uneasy in that hallway, but I passed it off as an overactive imagination. I slept the first night without any issues other than waking up a few times. The next morning at breakfast, one of my sisters mentioned feeling really uncomfortable in the hallway, almost as if the air was crushing. It unnerved me even more that I wasn't the only one who felt weirded out. Plus, she was an adult at the time, so it further cemented in my head that that wing of the hotel was odd. Later that night, I'm sleeping peacefully, when at about 2 a.m. I'm woken by something ripping the covers off of me and being jerked about 2 feet towards the end of the bed by my ankle. At first I thought someone had broken into my room because when I turned towards what had grabbed me, a huge, looming black shape was visible in the darkness, like a man was in my room. I frantically flipped the light on, only to have there be nothing there. The window was locked from the inside. There was no one in the closet or the bathroom, and my room was also still locked from the inside. I stayed up the rest of the night scared. The next morning we're at breakfast and my sister mentions that she was up half the night because she thought she saw a person silhouetted against the wall of the room. But when she turned on the light, there was no one there. It was just a bizarre and creepy experience. We checked out that day, so I didn't get to experience anything after that. But it still freaks me out to this day.
My grandma lives in a very stereotypical horror movie house. Small Midwest town, white and old-looking home on a farm. She even has a chipped wooden Mary nativity in the front yard. She also has a cemetery about a half a mile down the road. I used to sleep in the room in the corner on the top floor in my aunt's room. It had a wooden rocking chair in it. When I was younger, I would wake up because I thought I heard rocking, to the point where I would wake up my grandma and have to stay in her room. About 10 years later, my mom, aunt, and I were talking about how creepy my grandma's house was. My aunt goes on to talk about how when she was younger, the reason my mom and her ended up sharing a room was because she thought her room was haunted. She said she woke up in the morning and the rocking chair was about 2 feet closer to the bed. And after that night, it would start rocking on a nightly basis at midnight.
When my sister Betsy and I were kids, our family lived for a while in a charming old farmhouse. We loved exploring its dusty corners and climbing the apple tree in the backyard. But our favorite thing was the ghost. We called her Mother because she seemed so kind and nurturing. Some mornings, Betsy and I would wake up and on each of our nightstands, we'd find a cup that hadn't been there the night before. Mother had left them there, worried that we'd get thirsty during the night. She just wanted to take care of us. Among the home's original furnishings was an antique wooden chair, which we kept against the back wall of the living room. Whenever we were preoccupied watching TV or playing a game, Mother would inch that chair forward across the room towards us. Sometimes she'd manage to move it all the way to the center of the room. We always felt sad putting it back against the wall. Mother just wanted to be near us. Years later, long after we'd moved out, I found an old newspaper article about the farmhouse's original occupant, a widow. She'd murdered her 2 children by giving them each a cup of poisoned milk before bed. Then she hung herself. The article included a photo of the farmhouse's living room, with a woman's body hanging from a beam. Beneath her, knocked over, was that old wooden chair, placed exactly in the center of the room.
My family traveled to the south of France to stay in a cottage owned by someone my dad worked with. The owners visited occasionally, but that summer it was free and we had 10 days booked in there. After a long 2 days on the road, we drove down a steep driveway towards a secluded mill cottage, with the water wheel sat static alongside the stone house. There was a deep cellar with stone stairs down under the wheel next to the house, and a small river circled the place. We went into the house and chose rooms, but being sat down in a small copse, the house was draught and cold from the lack of use. We settled in and turned all of the heating on, yet the house remained cold and felt damp. The first night we had set a fire in the living room and listened to a couple of audiobooks before my sister and I went to sleep. My parents stayed up a little bit longer, then went to bed. Around midnight, they both woke up at exactly the same time, and the door to their bedroom was opening slowly. At first, they thought it was my sister, until they saw a large, dark silhouette of a man framed in the doorway, standing stock still, just looking in their direction as if appraising them. After a short period, the shape turned and started to move, as if satisfied, and disappeared. They looked at each other but didn't speak, and both went back to sleep. The next morning, the house felt warm and dry, and sunlight was back through the windows, as if something had lifted and accepted them. They spoke the next day and both agreed that although they were skeptics, it could not have been anything other than something supernatural in that doorway, deciding their worth.
Mommy told me never to go into the basement, but I wanted to see what was making that noise. It kind of sounded like a puppy, and I wanted to see that puppy. So I opened the basement door and I tiptoed down a bit. I didn't see a puppy, and then Mommy yanked me out of the basement and yelled at me. Mommy had never yelled at me before, and it made me sad and I cried. Then Mommy told me never to go into the basement again, and she gave me a cookie. That made me feel better, so I didn't ask her why the boy in the basement was making noises like a puppy or why he had no hands or feet.
A long time ago, back when I was in high school, maybe a freshman or sophomore, my mom was out of town for some reason. My younger brother and two sisters were staying with my grandparents. I was home alone. Monday morning, I'm up waiting for my grandpa to pick me up and give me a ride to school. We lived in an old historic 2-story house. I'm sitting downstairs in the living room watching TV, and all of a sudden I hear a man and a woman talking upstairs. They sound like they're in my mom's room. I then turned off the TV so I could hear it better. I could distinctly hear a man and a woman talking to each other. I couldn't hear individual words, just mumbling. I got up off the couch and started walking towards the stairs. As I'm walking across the room, I hear a small child speak. Again, no individual words, but the sound of muffled voices talking. Pretty freaked out, the voices are definitely happening. As I approach the bottom stair, something upstairs in my mom's room hits the floor, like a semi-loud thud. To me, it seemed like someone pulled a dresser drawer too far out, and it came out and hit the floor. The voices stopped immediately, and I ran outside and waited for my grandpa. Middle of winter, no coat. I didn't care. In 2013, Zombabi and her friends decided to make a Ouija board. Her best friend lives about 45 minutes drive from the closest store and nearest town, so there wasn't much to do. They'd spent the day watching movies, but eventually got bored. So Zombabi and her friend's boyfriend, and his friend, decided to make the board. About a week before they made the board, the two friends had been staying alone at the house when Zombabi woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway, nearing the bedroom. She tried to wake her friend, but it was no use. She was a heavy sleeper. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Zombabi waited, holding her breath for the door to open, but it never did. The next few hours she spent awake, waiting for something to happen. When both girls were finally awake by 11 a.m. the next morning, before either left the room, she told her friend what had happened the night before. What her friend said in response chilled her to the bone. She said that for years, she'd been hearing the same footsteps, and that they had always stopped right outside her bedroom. No one else had heard the footsteps until Zombabi did. That night, they made their Ouija board. The group were messing around with it, not getting any real responses when they suddenly heard a loud bang in the back of the house. They decided to stop for the night. The friend left to drive the other two home, leaving Zombabi alone at the house. Being alone after hearing the loud noise and the footsteps, it made her nervous, so she turned on the television for a distraction while she waited for her friend to return. In the middle of the opening credits, the television froze. It started making loud buzzing noises. She tried to turn off the TV, but the remote, it wouldn't work. Then she tried unplugging it, but it kept going. Thoroughly freaked out, she went outside to wait for her friend to get back. At this point, she had started shaking and crying and texted her friend explaining what had happened. Then the dogs started barking at the living room, viciously growling and snarling like they saw something no human could. 30 minutes later, her friend finally arrived back home. Both girls could hear the television from the porch, but when they went inside, it had completely shut off, and it was still unplugged. Neither are sure exactly what happened, but they're certain it was some kind of malevolent spirit. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked, and no one was allowed in there. She explained that it was the storeroom and that it was out of bounds. She reminded him of this several times before allowing him upstairs. So he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. However, the insistence of the woman had piqued his curiosity. So the next night, he walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his. And in the corner was a woman whose skin was incredibly pale. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. Was this a celebrity? The owner's daughter? He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. As he was still looking, the woman turned sharply, and he jumped back from the door, hoping she would not suspect he had been spying on her. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red color, unmoving Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before and had blocked the keyhole with something red. He felt embarrassed that he had made the woman so uncomfortable and hoped she had not made a complaint with the woman on the front desk. At this point, he decided to consult her for more information. She sighed and said,
Did you look through the keyhole?
The man told her that he had, and she said,
Well, I might as well tell you the story about what happened in that room. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in there, and we find that, even now, whoever stays there gets very uncomfortable. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were very red.
I was moving out and I left my old state to go to a new one. The city life was bad, and my life was going to get worse if I stayed there. I moved in about a day ago, which was all right, I suppose. I got all the furniture set up and my electronics ready. I always wanted a VCR, but never had the money or willpower to look for one, and if I were to look for one, the prices are way too expensive. Like, we're talking about prices in the thousands here. I wasted almost all of my money on the moving company and me moving between states. What I forgot about this new house was that there was an attic, which made me smile, because I hope that the previous owners left some things behind that they didn't care about. I go to the attic and climb the ladder, which they polished very nicely, and it looks like it was in great condition. And it was. It was very sturdy and supported my weight. I'm about 150 pounds and I'm 20 years old, keep in mind. So when I finally get to the attic, I looked around, but I didn't see anything. It was dark as hell, like pitch black dark. I climbed down the ladder and got my phone and turned on the flashlight feature. The brightness was all right, considering the phone isn't that good, but hey, it works, right? I returned to the attic ladder and climbed back up with my flashlight in hand. When I got back to the attic, I shined the light towards the other end. It's bright enough to where I can barely see the other end of the attic. I crawl more into the attic and I get on a knee before I shine the light in every direction. There was nothing in here except in the corner of the very end of the attic on the left side. I approach it and see that there's a box with a note on it. I pick it up and the note is read like so. Whatever you do, don't use this VCR and don't play the tape. Things will occur in which are unexplainable, but will cause damage to you in any way, shape, or form. If you happen to find this box, don't use it, and throw the box with the VCR and tape away. Burn it. Put it in acid. I don't care. Get rid of it. The note was from a previous owner, I guess, and the initial on the bottom of the note is H. I think to myself, but I don't think for long. I put the note aside and see the box labeled as unknown tape with VCR. Do not use, written in red ink. I looked around the attic and take the box and the note with me back downstairs. I set it down on the dining room table and open it up. It shouldn't hurt to open this box, right? What's inside the box is a VCR. It looks broken and dusty. The VCR is covered in dust. I lie the VCR on its side since it was flat, and sure enough, there was a tape that was just blank with no label on it. I don't know what this meant, and it doesn't mean well. I pull out the VCR and I plug it into my TV, and then I plug in the power to the VCR. I then turned on the TV and changed the output to TV channel 3. After the VCR was blue on the TV, I inserted the tape and I pressed play on the VCR. The tape started playing, but all there was is a black screen for a couple of minutes. It's weird, but I didn't think less of it. It could be the tape or the VCR itself. Then a sudden white screen flashed and the video was in color at this time. It seemed like it was a family of 5 around a table with red cloth, but in the middle of the tablecloth was a black cloth with a chalice on it. They were outside, but it looked like a ritual of some sort. One of the family members turns to the camera and held up her arm and started laughing. The camera zooms into her arm, which now had visible cuts and bleeding. I blinked many times to see if it was real or not, and sure enough, it was. The camera zooms back out, then zooms in on the chalice. It was black with red writing that was ineligible. One other family member started to say a chant that seemed to be Latin. The camera again zooms back out. What I see is blood running down the chalice covering the red writing. A couple of nooses. What seems odd is that it looked exactly like my backyard. I pause the tape and I look at the backyard. There it was. The table and the red and black tablecloths with a chalice on it. There were no people to be seen. I look back at the TV screen and I see that it continued playing, and I turned around again at the backyard and saw a noose at my door, hung up already, swaying back and forth, as if it's calling me to do it. I look back at it to see an extreme close-up of the female's face, smiling and laughing with black eyes. Her eyes are almost completely blacked out. There's no whiteness in her eyes anywhere. I stand back away from the screen and I turn around. As I turn around, I see the female hanging on the rope. She's laughing and laughing. I'm frozen in place by fear. I can't move. I can only observe what may seem my final moments. The female then unhangs herself, but leaves the noose swaying back and forth. She starts to approach me. She takes my hand and she drags me to the noose. Can't do anything but follow and comply with the female's request. She smiles and laughs, knowing what my fate is. I begin to feel myself move again. Once I feel my legs move, I make a run for it, and I run out of the house. She screams like a banshee chasing me. I close the front door and stand back. A couple of seconds later, I hear sirens and see them coming over the road. It was a black van with no logo of any company. The tires screech. And people start to burn the house down. Two of the guys grab me and put me in the back of their van. Once the house had finished burning, we drive off. I'm taken to a facility where I'm being questioned, but I haven't been told anything yet. I'm still waiting now, and this has been written during this time. I don't know when I'm going to be released. I don't know if I'll live again. I just have to wait. It was closing time at the diner. Alex locked the doors and was started on his side duties in the back. Wednesday nights were usually slow, so Alex was the only server on the floor. As he cleaned, he heard his manager call,
Alex, I'd like to speak with you in my office.
Confused and nervous, Alex wondered why the manager wanted to speak with him. He knew he did nothing wrong, so he couldn't put his finger on what this was about. As Alex walked to the office, he began to get a searing headache, like nothing he's ever felt before. He brushed it off and thought he'd take some pain meds when he was done speaking with the manager.
Alex, you didn't notice this gentleman waiting to be served? Why did he have to come and ask me if he could get some service? What are you doing out there?
Alex looked over at the chair his manager was pointing to, and his eyes grew wide. There was no one there. He looked at his manager and chuckled. "You're playing with me, right?" Alex said. Angrily, his manager said,
Does it look like I'm playing, Alex? This gentleman and his family stopped in for a quick bite before heading back to their hometown. And this is the service you give them?
Alex could see in his manager's eyes that he wasn't playing around. Hesitantly, Alex slowly looked back over at the chair and jumped back in disbelief at what he was seeing. There was a man with deep black eyes and a huge yellow smile, sitting in the chair staring at him. His face was sunk in. His hands were 3 times the size of a normal human being. His fingers were long and curved with pointed, almost rotten-looking fingernails. The man stood up, breathing intensely, as his smile grew bigger. He was about 6 feet tall, and he was wearing a ripped black shirt with dirty black jeans. Alex could see the man was ready to pounce at him, so he took off running, and not a second too late because the man leaped at Alex, almost grabbing him. You could hear the man slam into the office door and let out a loud grunt. Alex turned around to see the man. He's standing in the doorway, still smiling at him. Suddenly, the man started to run full speed toward Alex. You could hear his heavy footsteps getting closer and closer as Alex ran through the emergency exit doors. Barely escaping, Alex ran into the convenience store next door in hopes that someone could help. "Please help! There's somebody chasing me!" Alex yelled, running through the store frantically. There was an employee in one of the aisles who seemed unbothered by the yelling. He figured the employee had headphones in because there was no way they didn't hear him yelling for help. Alex ran over to the employee and said, "Please, help me! There's someone out there chasing me! We need to call 911! The employee put down the boxes they were stocking, slowly turned around, and looked at Alex with deep black eyes and a huge yellow smile.
During the summer of 1983, in a quiet town near Minneapolis, Minnesota, the charred body of a woman was found inside the kitchen stove of a small farmhouse. A video camera was also found in the kitchen, standing on a tripod, pointing at the oven. No tape was found inside the camera at the time. Although the scene was originally labeled as a homicide by police, an unmarked VHS tape was later discovered at the bottom of the farm's well, which had apparently dried up earlier that year. Despite its worn condition and the fact that it contained no audio, police were still able to view the contents of the tape. It depicted a woman recording herself in front of a video camera, seemingly using the same camera that the police found in the kitchen. After positioning the camera to include both her and the kitchen stove in its view, she turned on the oven, opened the door, crawled inside, and then closed the door behind her. After 8 minutes into the video, the oven could be seen shaking violently. At this point, thick black smoke emanated from it. For the remaining 45 minutes of the video, until the batteries in the camera died, it remained in its stationary position. To avoid disturbing the local community, the police never released any information about the tape, or even the fact that it was found. Police were also not able to determine who put the tape in the well, or why the height and stature of the woman in the video did not come close to matching the body they had found in the oven.
A few years ago, a mother and father decided they needed a break, so they wanted to head out for a night on the town. They called their most trusted babysitter. When the babysitter arrived, the two children were already fast asleep in bed, so the babysitter just got to sit around and make sure everything was okay with the children. Later that night, the babysitter got bored and went to watch TV. But she couldn't watch it downstairs because they didn't have cable downstairs. Seems the parents didn't want the children watching too much garbage. So she called them and asked if she could watch cable in the parents' room. Of course, the parents said it was okay. But the babysitter had one final request. She asked if she could cover up the angel statue outside the bedroom window with a blanket or a cloth because it made her nervous. The phone line was silent for a moment, and the father, who was talking to the babysitter at the time, said, "Take the children and get
The police found both of the children and the babysitter slumped in pools of their own blood within 3 minutes of the call. No statue was found.
I heard this story from a cousin of mine who lives in a small village in the state of Rajasthan, in India. A story of an incident that happened many years ago when the country was still under British rule. In this village lived an old, frail woman named Lilawati. Well, not exactly. She wasn't allowed too often into the village at all. Neither were her companions, who lived in a separate area on the outskirts of the village. Lilawati was a professional mourner, along with her other female companions. In some parts of India, there is a strange custom where when someone belonging to an important family would die, they would not be allowed to mourn because of their social status. So they called in professional mourners, who'd take in all the information they could about the recently deceased and cry out loud enough for the whole village to listen. Tears would flow like rivers, and their wails would be louder than thunder as they beat their chest in sorrow while walking along the funeral procession. This custom is known as Rudali. They would always dress in black, and people would steer clear of them, thinking that they are inauspicious and would bring bad luck to the village. Lilawati was the oldest of them all. She had even forgotten her age. Her husband had died years ago, and she had no children. But her voice was the loudest when crying out during funerals. She was an expert at what she did. Every once in a while, a representative from the colonials would come on down to collect the tax. The village was within a few miles of a large house the British had made to house important officers and other personnel from time to time. This house was currently occupied by Captain Smith, who was practically worshipped by the local merchants of the village, for he could get them a license to trade opium. One day, Smith was passing through the dusty road, going past the village, riding on his prize horse. He had gotten the horse from the stables of a Maharaja. As he was riding past, he saw a small black figure lying on the road. It was Lilawati. She had gone to fetch water from the village well and had tripped and fell. She was bleeding from her forehead, and her broken earthen pot lay next to her, leaking water over the dusty road. She reached out and groaned for help,
मेरी मदद करो.
grabbing Smith's boot as he slowed down beside her. Despite not understanding what she was saying, Smith knew she needed help. But he was disgusted by this woman. An old, frail hag, lying on the road. How dare she even touch him? He kicked her off and rode on, going back home. Lilawati was found dead the next morning. She was cremated near the river, and the priest at the village temple presided over it to pray for her soul. However, her soul wasn't that prepared to move on. Later that night, as Smith lay in his bed, he heard someone wailing outside his house. The cry was so sorrowful, it pulled at his heart. He had never heard a sound so depressing before. But strangely, he was drawn towards it. He climbed out of his window and walked towards the road. The weeping grew louder with every step. As he reached the road, he fell to his knees and started bawling himself, his head held in his hands. Smith's dead body was found by the road by his maid the next morning. The villagers say that Leelawati still fulfills her duties to this day. Every time someone in the village dies, you can hear her crying and beating her chest that night, walking through the dirt roads of the village. They call her the Weeping Woman, and they leave a coin on the road outside their house when someone passes away, as a payment, for she has mourned their loss. In June 1972, a woman appeared in Cedars-Sinai Hospital in nothing but a white, blood-covered gown. Now, this in itself should not be too surprising, as people often have accidents nearby and they come to the nearest hospital for medical attention. But there were two things that have caused people who saw her to vomit and flee in terror. The first being that she wasn't exactly human. She resembled something close to a mannequin, but had the dexterity and fluidity of a normal human being. Her face was as flawless as a mannequin's. Devoid of eyebrows and smeared in makeup, there was a kitten clamped in her jaws so unnaturally tight that no teeth could be seen, and the blood was still squirting out over her gown and onto the floor. She then pulled it out of her mouth, tossed it aside, and then collapsed. From the moment she stepped through the entrance to when she was taken to a hospital room and cleaned up before being prepped for sedation, she was completely calm, expressionless, and motionless. The doctors thought it best to restrain her until the authorities could arrive, and she didn't protest. They were unable to get any kind of response from her, and most staff members felt too uncomfortable to look directly at her for more than a few seconds. But the second the staff tried to sedate her, she fought back with extreme force. Two members of staff had to hold her down as her body rose up on the bed with that same blank expression. She turned her emotionless eyes towards the male doctor, and she did something unusual. She smiled. As she did, the female doctor screamed and let go in shock. In the woman's mouth were not human teeth, but long, sharp spikes. Far too long for her mouth to close fully without causing any damage. The male doctor stared back at her for a moment before asking, "What in the hell are you?" She cracked her neck down to her shoulder to observe him, still smiling. There was a long pause. The security had been alerted and could be heard coming down the hallway. As he heard them approach, she darted forward, sinking her teeth into the front of his throat, ripping out his jugular and letting him fall to the floor, gasping for air as he choked on his own blood. She stood up and leaned over him, her face coming dangerously close to his as the life faded from his eyes. She leaned closer and she whispered in his ear, The doctor's eyes filled with fear as he watched her calmly walk away to greet the security men. His last ever sight would be watching her feast on them, one by one. The female doctor who survived the incident named her the Expressionless. There was never a sighting of her again. During August 2018, my friends and I took a road trip from New York City to Rhode Island. None of us had been to Rhode Island before, so we were excited about the drive. especially because we had rented a Mustang convertible for it. We left a little later than expected. It was about 10:30 p.m., and since it was a busy Friday night, we decided to punch our destination into the Waze traffic app to beat the traffic. Eventually, we started losing steam, so my friend in the back seat fell asleep and I just kept driving along quietly, when my friend in the passenger seat told me to exit the freeway to take a side road. At first, driving on the unlit, winding back roads was relaxing, but then the wind picked up, and it got increasingly foggy and misty. I wasn't scared, per se, just a little on the edge. I thought about pulling over to put the top up, but decided against it since there were no cars in sight. Heavy rain was projected for the entire weekend, so I wanted to get the most out of the convertible. So I kept going along as normal, if not a little too fast, to get back into the main roads as quickly as possible, when something just shifted. I don't know how to explain it other than the unsettling exposed feeling. I remember pulling my sweater over my legs to cover up. Then my friend up front told me to look at the street sign in the distance. It read, Purgatory. We woke up our friend in the back seat, who sort of scoffed. Seconds later, we were around a bend where a large red cross was installed on the side of the road, with nothing else in sight. We just shrugged it off as a creepy coincidence. By then, we were kind of joking about and indulging in the spookiness. But around the next bend, a big truck came hurtling down a one-lane road, aimed straight at us. Luckily, my impulse was to swerve a little to the side, otherwise it probably would have resulted in a head-on collision. My friend tried to get his license plate number, but he sped off, while my other friend found the quickest route away from this particular road. We didn't really discuss what happened afterwards because we were too creeped out, and we haven't talked about it since. While writing this story, I decided to look it up. I spent an hour trying to retrace our route and found the little road. It was indeed named Purgatory, and though we didn't notice it at the time, Google Maps revealed that Purgatory Road was situated next to an old graveyard. Curious about this road, I researched it further and discovered that 2 teen girls had died there in August of 2011. In an accident on their way to visit the grave of Rhode Island's infamous vampire, Mercy Brown, who died in 1892. Apparently, they decided to go for a drive down this dark, windy road because they thought it looked haunted. This planet has wind. This planet has water. This planet has fields upon fields of thorny yellow trees, frothing oceans covered with orange algae, and mountains that are more ice than rock. This planet has life. This planet has cities, great sprawling cities that at the hands of Earth's finest architect could not create, of beauty that Earth's finest artist could not put to paper. This planet has monoliths that reach towards the heavens in great spirals, structures that were clearly built by intelligent life. This planet has everything that ours does, only greater, stranger, and more beautiful. The more that we discovered what this planet did have, the more we were confounded by what it didn't. There weren't any animals. No four-headed fauna gazing through the meadows of tall white grass. No fanged and scaly monsters soaring through the dark gray clouds. No leviathans lurking beneath the stormy orange seas. But the cities were empty too. Each and every edifice they had built to scrape the skies we found empty. Marvels of technology had gone into erecting these structures, and each tower was filled with hints as to how this species lived. They had foods, fruits with thick hides that could only be eaten with razor-sharp teeth. They had tools shaped to accommodate great slashing claws, and even a language that they etched neatly onto tables. But there was no one there to explain it to us. No leader to be taken to. No one to which we might utter the words that had been itching on our tongues since we first crawled from the caves. We come in peace. No one. It was as if the entire species had vacated just before our arrival. As if they had vanished into this world's frigid and unbreathable wind. Our confusion only grew as we searched the towers for signs of life, only to find each one unfalteringly empty. When we reached the very last level of the very last building, we sat back, puzzled and alone on this cold, empty planet. We sat there in silence, and then we looked up. Oh God, then we looked up.